Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another session of the nuts and bolts of writing. This time, I'm joined by Helevorn here. Helevorn has been
Hello.
creating a historical novel called Lucky Wolf, which can be read on Tapas. Link in description. Lucky Wolf takes place in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia and tells the story of a healer and mystic called Eyolf. He is someone who goes against traditional gender norms and is someone who does anything and everything to achieve his goals. Eventually, he falls for the cold warrior, Ingvar, with whom he develops a touching rapport. The first question I have for you is, this is a really great historical fiction work. So what got you into historical fiction in the first place?
Okay, so thanks for the questions. I think I always had a passion for historical fiction. Um, Ever since I started reading, like many of us, I grew up on adventure fictions Robert Louis Stevenson, Alexandre Dumas, Jules Verne, and actually my first attempt to write a novel happened when I was like 10 years old, I think, and I started writing a rip-off of Jules Verne's Joan de Vacances. Pardon my French, I don't really speak French, but I think it was two years vacation with a group of children at puberty stranded on a desert island, and this kind of Robinsonian scenario. And this is exactly what I wrote, but I gave them girl protagonists. Um, Two redhead twins with curly hair. I think that will ring a bell for you because I have a thing. I still have a thing for that kind of character. So that was my first attempt, and I got pretty far, I think, with that. But it was of course a rip-off, and it happened in the 19th century, and it had that kind of scenario. So um, and well, later on, when I was in high school, I read The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, and it was mind blowing because it somehow opened another path for me. It was that same Robinsonian scenario with 12-year-old kids, virtually that 2 years vacation, but it was so much realistic in terms of psychology and interactions and portrayal of human nature, and it was also more surreal. It had symbolism and allegory, and I actually got into that sort of fiction. So I love that sort of combination between adventure or apparent adventure or a scenario that is typical for adventure literature, but it actually reveals more of the inner workings of the mind than you would expect. So I think in a way that is uh, my premise with my works. So as you know, most of my works are set in the Viking Age. So I sort of take a lot of elements from sagas. Those kind of plots where everybody is essentially an asshole, as we would call them nowadays. But back then they were just called heroes, and they were killing each other for the throne and everything. But to that, I try to add as many elements of realism as I can. So in some stories, I do focus on that, and in others, I just try to focus on different aspects of reality because people were virtually the same as they were as they are nowadays in terms of preoccupations and I mean. Uh, Inner preoccupations, and I think this is what I try to show. I try to show as many aspects as possible. So in my short stories, I have some where people just talk for the entire short story, as you know, and I have others where they fight and do all that
Mhm.
kind of thing. So I think it's something like that. Of course, in my beginnings, like a lot of people I know, I was also influenced by Tolkien, but I never really got into fantasy fiction a lot, because what I actually loved about Tolkien was his vast knowledge of the Anglo-Saxon and of the Norse world. So this is what captivated me. I was actually the more I found out about this medieval Germanic world, yeah, if I could call it that, the more I was interested in rereading his works and trying to see how he got his inspiration from that. Finding the medieval elements. So even in a famous work of fantasy like that of Tolkien, I was still searching for the historical elements, and I was fascinated by how he transformed all of that into a work of fantasy.
Ah, I see. Yeah, I think Tolkien
Mhm.
is definitely a very well-read man. I mean, he has a lot of influences in his work. And from what I remember, I think the elves were actually inspired by Finnic cultures, right? Maybe a mix of Germanic and Finnic.
Yeah, yeah, and Celtic as well.
Hmm.
So yeah,
How
yeah,
about the
and
dwarves? What were they inspired by?
definitely Norse, because they
Oh,
are they're
right. The beards, right? The armor.
yeah, 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 and they dwarves are creatures in Norse mythology.
Oh,
But well, actually, Norse mythology, we don't really know what they understood by dwarves in terms of height, because they never actually mention the height. Sometimes they just it feels like they are the same height as a normal person. So we don't really know if they looked uh, like people represent them nowadays.
okay. So how did people start interpreting them as being very short?
Mm, maybe it was, I don't know, I'm just speculating here. Maybe it was sort of a corroboration with other fantasy creatures maybe from English folklore. So,
Like
I don't
hobbits?
know.
Because the hobbits were short, right?
Yeah, yeah, they were short.
Who's
Yeah,
shorter? Like, are hobbits shorter or dwarves? I actually don't haven't figured that out.
hobbits are
Oh,
shorter.
they're the
Yeah,
shortest. Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I think this is what captivated me about Tolkien so much. And of course, he was my role model. I always wanted to speak Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse and all that, and to be a scholar in this field when I was a kid. And I was just reading that. I said, "Oh, this is going to be me. I will be a writer and a scholar." So we could safely say that he was my role model in life. But he was the role model of a lot of people I know, and not everybody went in the same direction as authors as I did. So he's so, like you said, well read, that he inspired people in so many different ways.
Hmm. So, how do you think historical fiction is generally presented or viewed, especially in the mainstream?
Um, I think that first of all, we rely a lot um, on on older stereotypes, because first of all, now I'm going to talk mainly about this kind of dark ages fiction, mainly the Viking Age, because of course historical includes a great range of periods and settings. But if we think about this setting, it's uh, based on saga literature, and also historical novel, the kind of historical novel that was really popular in the 19th century. It was realism, but it was written in a certain way without all that psychological insight that the literary current of modernism, for example, brought to it. And I think that a lot of the historical fiction nowadays is based on stereotypes created by this kind of literature. So medieval literature on the one hand, and that kind of 19th century realist fiction that and um, and I think it's difficult to go out of those stereotypes, because when we say a Viking Age story, we mainly think about an adventure story. So it is difficult to imagine it as something other than an adventure story. But the medieval world is just as complex as our world. You can basically touch any theme. Of course, not technology per se, but any psychological uh, theme, yeah, that we can touch nowadays. So it's really complex, and I think it's not it can always be explored more. I'm not saying that there aren't great works of fiction that do that already, but it can be done more. And in the mainstream, I don't know, I don't really see very good representations.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think it's not uh, just about respecting historical accuracy, because it doesn't have to be a scholarly work, a page from an academic journal, but it has to feel realistic. And that's also, it also lies in the way the characters are made and the way they behave, like any other work of fiction.
Mhm. What is the most famous historical work in our like today, do you think?
Historical work.
Fiction.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, historical work of fiction. Well, we have a lot of historical fantasy that's or uh, pseudo medieval fantasy that's really famous. I'm not really sure if there's anything into the mainstream that is purely historical, because they all take a lot of artistic license. I don't know. So
Yeah, I can't really think of one either right now.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I guess Dunkirk. Does that count?
Oh yeah, yeah, of
Because I
course.
was thinking of
I was
books.
stuck into
Yeah.
this medieval setting,
Mhm.
and trying to think about that. Oh yeah, of course.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Uh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, in medieval, I can't really think of any. I don't know. Like, I guess the Vikings. I know they're a really bad example.
Yeah,
And you're right.
exactly.
There's a lot of stereotypes with that one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is why this is what I was thinking. But yes, more recent time period. Yeah. Then there are a lot of great works. But I think that the medieval times are have the worst representation, the less realistic representation. And I
Mhm.
think this is why, because medieval literature, uh, that literature that is was actually written in the Middle Ages, that is also very far fetched. So I think this is what people think, So not a lot of authors come back to a medieval setting with techniques that we would use in writing a different kind of story, like writing a slice of life story, for example. So
Mhm.
something that's really deep and based on characters and thinking processes. We
Mhm.
can do that, and it would be interesting. It would show a lot of things that are missing from that kind of fiction.
I think the issue is a lot of people, when they think about like medieval fiction, they just think about, oh, the clothes or like the background or like where it takes place. They're really focused on the aesthetic and maybe the plot. Like, they want something like a Dan Brown novel. A lot of things are happening. It's like a thriller. I really want to know what happens next. But they're not as attached to the characters because they're not
Mhm.
really well developed. Like they're pretty much like a second thought. Like in it might be kind of snobbish, but some people I was reading this forum on Reddit where they were talking about literary versus entertainment fiction. And someone described entertainment fiction as fiction basically being plot oriented and the characters are just like, just props. They're just there. to make the plot progress, but they're not really existing as people in and of themselves. On the other hand, literary fiction, which I know is a very broad category, as well as probably maybe a slightly snobbish category. Basically, what it usually refers to, though, are these stories that are not necessarily plot driven, but they're character driven. So, like, they can have a very complex plot, but the main thing is how the characters are developed. Or they can be one of those novels where there's no plot. It's just a guy talking about his life, and he's like, maybe he's about like 70 years old and about to die, and he's like, oh, I kind of wasted my life. I kind of suck. And he's just thinking about the past. Like, that's a classic literary novel.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So basically, I do agree with you. There's not many historical works that are, quote unquote, a literary work. They're more like the entertainment genre or like the plot driven genre, where basically it's like a page turner or thriller.
Yes. That's right. That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And this is what I was thinking as well.
Mhm. So your work, Lucky Wolf, is contributing to historical fiction in this sense. It's basically very psychological, but at the same time, it's also very historical. How do you balance these elements of psychological writing, especially when applying like modern techniques of psychological writing with historical research? Do you find it's difficult to balance historical research while maintaining a focus on the characters?
Um, well, I I had done a lot of research beforehand because I've been interested in this subject for many years, and I think historical fiction does require a lot of research. So by the time I started writing Lucky Wolf, I had uh, the basics, of that Viking Age world. So it wasn't all that difficult to detach myself from the historical aspect and just create characters. It was actually the first story that I wrote that where I actually started from the characters. I usually started developing a story in the past either from the uh, themes or from the plot, but never. I never began constructing the story around the characters. So this is the first time I did this. I had my character Ingvar, who was one of my oldest characters. Um, I think he was my oldest character, right? And then I created Elf, and I didn't really have a plot in mind. I had the setting, which is basically the setting in the novel that I started a long time ago, and I hope I will finish one day in this life, Sons of Disobedience. And the setting is the conversion of Norway to Christianity. So I wanted something set in those years. At the end of the first millennium, and this is basically what I wanted from the plot. I didn't want to develop it so much, but I focused it on the relationship between two characters and the the prejudice they have when they first meet each other, the false appearances and the way they misunderstand each other, and at the same time they are intrigued by each other and they start to discover each other. So I made them very different types of people. So Ingvar, um, Ingvar is the I should I should call him the typical Viking hero in from the outside. That kind of hero that we find in sagas, who is a great warrior, acclaimed by everybody, who had a really full life. He traveled all around the world, or the world that was known to Scandinavians at the time. So he's seen as wise, far traveled, great physical prowess. He never loses a fight, and so on. So there are a lot of myths around him. But at the same time, as we delve deeper into the character, we find out that he isn't really typical at all. Um, starting from the fact that he is um, I think I could describe him in terms of an obsessive compulsive disorder. If he were to be a disorder, this is what he is, because he's very he's cold and silent and rigid. Um, he has a rule-bound lifestyle, and he is also very productive, overachieving, and all that. But he has some trauma from his childhood, and he often thinks of himself as a monster. He doesn't really. He does have some qualms of conscience about the things that he had to do in his life to get where he is now, and. This is one of the things that I wanted to do with my characters. So we have this medieval world that is very brutal compared to what we, the average reader, so to speak, live in nowadays. We have, if we are to look at the sagas, we see everybody is killing each other. They are all betraying each other. So in order to be a hero in that kind of world, okay, the sagas describe you as brave, just, honorable, but what do those values mean in the Middle Ages as opposed to what they mean to us nowadays? If they are described as kind, would we describe that person as kind?
Mm-hmm.
What is honor in our time versus what is honor in that world? I mean, it was considered honorable that if I don't know, someone killed your son, you go and kill their son. It was perfect. It was a thing of honor. You had to do that. Nowadays, would we consider that honorable, someone who does that? You know, so I try to play a bit with those ideas, and this is why well, most of my characters, and especially those who had those who thrive in that world, those who become prosperous people, they aren't what we would call good guys nowadays, because I don't think they can be uh, fully good. They can have qualms of conscience, they can regret things and think about themselves a lot in their choices, but they had to make certain choices to overcome um, the situation. And we're talking about a world where there is a lot of death that surrounds you because of illnesses and whatnot. So people aren't as sensitive to death and to poverty and to lacking things as the average reader would be nowadays. So I played on that with both of my protagonists. And on the other hand, so we have this warrior, cold figure. And on the other hand, we have Aelf, who is pretty much the opposite in most respects. He is outgoing, he is flirtatious, he embraces the bodily as well as the spiritual. He's a mystic and a healer, but he's most of all a showman, I think. So this is what first creates the conflict between Ingvar and Eowulf, because um, Ingvar's mother was a witch, and she was that kind of person who actually heard voices. So this is what Ingvar understands by a witch. He thinks that my mother's magic was true, but Eyolf, look at him. He's just making a show. Everything is for show for him. So he believes that Eyolf is a fraud. Getting to know him better, he realizes that okay, he lacks the scruples that Ingvar has, and in a way he is a fraud. You know what I mean? But at the same time, he's a very good physician, and this is how they one way in which they start to bond.
Mm-hmm. I see. That makes sense. So I think, as I recall, Eyolf himself learned magic from another shaman, or like another woman who was also trained in magic. what is the difference between the magic that shamanist taught him versus the kind of magic that Ingvar's mother knew about?
All right, right. That's a good question. Well, first of all, Ingvar's mother was Sami or half. This is what well, Norse people thought that Sami people had innate magical powers. So they were more highly regarded as wise women or wise men. So first of all, in the sagas, the magic is described as often dealing with animals and spirits. Well, this is the Norse perspective, yeah. So this is how 13th century Norwegians saw that culture. So this is sort of what Ingvar's mother does, but an okay, I should mention here that in Norse society, magic was mostly the realm of women, and especially healing magic. Men appear as magicians, as wise men, but they usually are termed in a well contemporary translation warlocks. So they don't really do any healing magic. But this is how Eyolf enhances the magic that he's being taught. So he is taught healing magic, and he does it even though he is a man. And this is where Eyolf plays with gender roles a lot. Um, Practitioners of magic are often presented in sagas as uh, negative characters, and mostly the men. And there are a lot of theories as to why that happens, and we don't really know the answer. But one of the speculations is that in order to practice magic, you had to employ a certain type of behavior, and also the outfit and accessories of a woman. And this is why it was dedicated and performed by women. So the fact that Eyolf does that would be, well, frowned upon in that overly manly society, but at the same time, he makes a show out of it, and this is how he enhances what he is taught. There aren't any magic practitioners that become so popular as Elf is. He sort of knows. He's a good psychologist. He knows what people want. He knows that sex sells, for instance, and this is what he basically makes his career upon that. He thinks that he's an incarnation of Freyr, god of fertility, and he has all these flamboyant rituals with a lot of acting. He even has a troupe of actors that he sometimes invites, and they reenact mythical scenes with gods, something slightly erotic, like Freyr's marriage or something like that. So it's always some on the erotic side, and he has these lavish parties, and people are into that, and this is what makes him famous, as opposed to his mentor, who just heals and goes from town to town to heal people. So he takes it to a different level,
Mhm.
and not his mentor and not Ingvar's mother do this. This is why he's a bit shocking. He is controversial, but at the same time, he is very successful at
Mhm.
that moment when he
How,
reaches his
mhm.
height.
How does Ingvar see his success? Since you mentioned previously that he sees him as a showman rather than as, a legit shaman, does he also doubt his magic and think that, Eyolf is kind of like a superficial person who is just here for the money and the fame and not really for the magic?
Yes, definitely, definitely. He actually has doubts about Elf really having faith in the gods, because he seems so superficial and materialistic to Ingvar. Um, this is also because Ingvar is this very rigid person who resents anything that has to do with sexuality, with the body. He isn't even open about his own inner life, and he finds it. He doesn't like. Being near people. He doesn't like physical contact and just talking to people. He's very aloof, and he's very suspicious of Eyolf because he's the exact opposite. And especially when he finds out that um, Eyolf is uh, he lied about his background. Um, he was he was very poor, and he's a self-made man who eventually becomes rich, but he doesn't just use this from rags to riches story. Instead, he lies about his origins, and he says that he's a renegade nobleman. He thinks it sounds a lot better. So of course at once Ingvar adds all this up and finds out that he lied about certain things, he will assume that he lies about much more. So he doesn't know how he can trust him again. But what makes him trust him first and foremost was when he discovers that he's actually a good physician. So
I see.
and then Ingvar reconsiders what magic means. So what is magic? Somebody who hears voices, or somebody who really heals people who are someone is dying, and he does something, whatever that is, and they really return to health. So
Hmm.
what is more magical?
I see. So, what is Ingvar's faith? Like, does he also strongly believe in the gods in general? Like, before meeting Eyolf, was he a very strong, believer of the Norse gods, or did he always have doubts? Did meeting Eyolf change his view on religion?
Mm, Ingvar is a very skeptical person overall, so he's really skeptical about religion and about the gods as well. So he does believe, but I think he sees the gods more as symbols rather than real beings that are out there and that really did all those things that the myths tell us that they did. So this is, of course, he's a stranger to any kind of scientific theory. So he can only believe that the world was made by a higher power, but not necessarily as it appears in the stories that they know. And this, in a way, makes him more likely to understand other religions as well, or more open in a way to other religions as well, which is kind of ironic because um, that in my novel he opposes the conversion of Norway to Christianity, but he does that more because of his ideals. He doesn't think that it's fair for people to change the beliefs they've had for centuries because of some political reasons. So this is what he believes, even though he understands Christianity a lot better than those who are fervent believers in the gods of his ancestors.
Mm,
So
that makes sense.
he's more of a philosopher in this respect. He retains a philosophical skepticism, we could say. But yes, he reassesses a lot of things. Ingvar Eyolf, sorry, is much more of a believer in this respect. He never questions everything. He just has a peculiar way of showing it.
Hmm.
He sometimes acts as if he can demand things from the gods and as if they were on the same level. So, but he never doubts any of it.
Hmm. That's
So
kind of
his face is
ironic. Yeah. I think it's a little bit ironic in my view because Eyolf is, viewed as a showman, and sometimes showmen don't really believe in the stuff that they keep on talking about. But ironically, Eyolf is the one who believes in the gods the most out of him and Ingvar.
Yes, definitely, definitely, and he is a showman, but he enhances the things that he already believes and things that he already does, including those his sexuality. You know, he's very open. He really believes the things he says. He just dresses them in a more flamboyant and attractive way. But what he says is actually true. He does believe in all those things.
I see. So, how do Eyjolf and Ingvar fall in love despite their differences?
Oh yeah. Yes. Well, I don't really know if I think it's love because it's definitely not first and foremost physical for Ingvar because he has troubles in this respect. But I think they first of all they are intrigued by the other, and then they start to discover that they have certain things in common. They discover that the other is not as bad as they initially thought, and Ingvar is very much attracted to uh, intelligent conversation and philosophy and science. And once they start to get into that, and he sees that Elf is actually an he really is an intelligent man, and he overturns his expectations about everything, about social class, about religion. So he really makes him reassess a lot of things. Ingvar was always the snobbish kind of person because he comes from a family with tradition, and he was brought up to think that he deserves to be a nobleman and even to become king and all of that. So he takes all that for granted, and I think before meeting Elf, he was kind of biased about people from lower classes. But once he realizes that Elf is, well, more intelligent than most of the noblemen he knows, uh, he reassesses even that. So it changes his perspectives greatly. And for Elf, what he finds attractive about Ingvar, well, of course, he will never admit that he falls in love. He will always say that it's something physical, that it's a challenge for him because he is, well, this kind of person who just wants to seduce people. But I think he admires Ingvar greatly because a man who went through so much to get from being very poor to where Elf is now, of course he will admire Ingvar, who always had those things. He admires him in the sense that, "Oh, I wish I was him." So I think it's based on admiration and intellectual stimulation, we can say. So that this is what they have in common when they bond.
hmm
So it and it develops into
hmm
something more eventually.
Does Eyjolf challenge any of Ingvar's previously held beliefs about gender?
Oh yes, gender. Yeah, that is actually one of the themes of the story because I wanted to explore this idea that is not it is touched upon in sagas and in Norse medieval poetry, but it is not really developed as much. So um, the practice of magic by men is often has the connotation of effeminacy. So Odin, the chief of the gods, is also accused of that because he practices magic, and he is often told that he's too feminine. So Loki um, uh, is another god who is known to be non-binary, and he also dabbles in magic. So this is kind of a stereotype, and it appears a lot not only in myths but also in relation to real life, or as real as saga characters can be, male practitioners of magic. So I wanted to play a bit with that, and overturn the expectations of rigid people like Ingvar about gender as well. Um, well, Eyolf is kind of he's openly bisexual, and well, it was pretty frowned upon in medieval society, because they thought sexuality in terms of active and passive. So it depends on what it is assumed about him, but he is regarded with suspicion, we can say. And um, of course, they didn't understand sexuality quite as we understand it nowadays. So we can't. I always refrain from using terms that we use nowadays, because they wouldn't think of
Mhm.
themselves like that. So Ingvar was never one to really believe in gender stereotypes. So of course they were all raised to believe that a man should be very manly. But what that actually means is subject to interpretation. Ingvar believes he is manly enough because he does all that fighting, and he is strong, and he is honorable, and he is wise. So he doesn't really have a problem with anything else. So he doesn't. Um, hmm, he proves not to be as rigid in that respect as one would eventually believe, because he doesn't much believe in stereotypes. Anyway, he's a misanthropist. He hates everybody equally, we could say.
Mhm. I think that Ingvar and his, asexuality, or his perceived asexuality, is also, against the stereotype of what a manly man is. Because you would expect someone, I think the sagas probably have this too, where this manly man who's a warrior, he's brave, he's strong, he's wise. I mean, he usually is with a lot of women and has a lot of children. But Ingvar is never interested in marriage. As it turns out, he is gay, but he doesn't really want to engage in physical intercourse either.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. I omitted that aspect when I started talking about stereotypes of the warrior, and how Ingvar overturns those expectations. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, one would expect him to become a great family patriarch, because the more fame and money you have, and more prowess in battle and business, the more well, women and children you have, right?
Mhm.
But he's very far from all that, and um, yes, he is, I think, well, demisexual, if we were to assign something like that to him. So he's I don't even think that he would be sexually interested in someone who is not as in your face as Aelf. So with Aelf, it's kind of difficult not to think about sex. So even he thinks about that, because if you were to meet someone who is more discreet, he would probably not even think about it.
I see.
Or it would take him a very long time to get used to that person in order to think about it.
That makes sense. Like, for example, Aiden, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, he's very discreet, and he never manifests himself in that way. So Ingvar as well, he actually wouldn't even want to think about their relationship in that way.
Mm.
He's still, after his relationship with Ilf, he's still quite rigid in that respect.
Mhm. Well, Aolf is kind of like the opposite, right? He represents like a feminine man, or kind of like the feminine but in a male body, but he's very sexual. He's like the opposite of the manly man, who ironically, in as represented by Ingvar, is asexual, but him as a feminine man is very sexual.
Oh yes, yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and he's also bisexual. So he maybe it's not what people would expect in his time when they see him dressed in well, dresses, well, robes, we could say, but they are, well, he looks very feminine with beads and all that. So he wears outfits that people would associate with a woman, and he does that very openly, but at the same time he is bisexual. So which actually shows, or this is what he thinks, his openness towards the body. He thinks that the body is the vessel of the soul, and spirituality is achieved through physicality and through accepting your body and accepting your sexuality. So the more accepting you are in this respect, the more open spiritually you can become. And this is what he bases his religious philosophy on, the philosophy of love, I imagine he would call it.
So what is Ingvar's view on spirituality? Is it more like cerebral? Because he does not really focus on the bodily or the physical. So is his philosophy solely about how one thinks? Because you did mention before he's really in love with how Eyolf thinks. And later, I
Yes,
think with Aiden as well, right?
definitely. Yes, it's first and foremost cerebral. Yes, he's a very rational person. Well, other than those moments when he loses control and in a berserker-like rage, so to speak. So, he is the person who represses a lot of emotion, and he cannot express his emotion, and he has moments when he bursts out. But other than that, yeah, he's very detached, and this is how he is in relation uh, to spiritual matters as well.
Mm-hmm.
But he's seen as very religious by other people, in that he is wise, they would say, or knowledgeable in the lore, so to speak. And
Mm-hmm.
this is what people at the time would appreciate, would value greatly, because it is a sign of wisdom, right, that he's an intellectual. If he lived in a different world, not the medieval Scandinavia, uh, he would love to be a scholar, but he didn't have the opportunity there, because well, the society was basically illiterate at that point. Or, well, they did have the runes, but uh, they didn't actually write. They didn't write books. They used runes just as just to inscribe, in the memory of my father or something. But they don't have the habit of writing down their beliefs and writing fiction and all that. So if he lived in a different world, he would love to be a scholar, but he would most probably give up the warrior thing to be a scholar. And this is what fascinates him about both about Aelf and about Aiden later on. So he doesn't really judge them. Oh, you're not manly enough, or you're not respectable enough because you aren't a warrior. He doesn't. He finds a lot of value in the intellectual pursuit.
So that's also breaking another stereotype, right?
Yes, definitely, definitely.
In general, what do you think was the most difficult part of writing Lucky Wolf?
I think it was difficult to get into Ingvar's head, which is sort of ironic, because he's one of, well, my oldest character, and because he's this kind of very aloof person, sometimes I had trouble imagining how he would, how he interacts with other people. I knew very well how he thinks, but not really how he interacts, because he represses all these thoughts and emotions so much. And with Ingvar, it's always this great difference between how he appears when we see him from the outside and what goes on through his head most of the time. I think never, no one can guess what actually goes on through his mind, because he seems very perhaps unimpressionable, even apathetic. He seems to be bored by everything most of the time, but there's a whole world going on in his head. So this is what I tried with Lucky Wolf. Uh, I used at times in certain chapters a first-person perspective. So Ingvar's point of view in first person, and it was really interesting for me to do that. Ironically, even though I sort of understand Ingvar's way of thinking, or not understand, but identify with Ingvar's way of thinking more, Elf was so much easier to write. I will not really say more fun, because I love writing Ingvar as well, but Elf just came natural because, well, he's so open, and so writing him was really fun. So yeah.
Hmm. Do you think it's easier to write Ingvar in a third person setting or point of view?
Um, hmm, that's a good question. Um, yes, in a way, it is easier, but I'm not. Um, it definitely doesn't give as much insight to the reader, because the reader would not guess what is actually going on in his mind. So writing about Ingvar in third person will requires a lot of subtext from me as a writer. So I have to pay a lot of attention to how I write those passages, what I want to show that he's actually thinking about something. His eyes aren't really blank as they
Hmm.
appear, and his immovable face actually hides something. And it's a challenge to write that. So even those crazy, trippy moments where Ingvar has those all those doubts, I have those passages with stream of consciousness, and he thinks all these crazy things that I think a normal person wouldn't really think, and even those things in a way were easier to write than all the subtext I have to put into the scenes where I present him in third person.
Hmm. I see.
It depends, of course. If it's an omniscient perspective, then yes, of course, it would be easy, because I would just describe his thoughts as the all-knowing author. But that's just too easy. I don't do that. I prefer the challenge. Actually, I rarely use that perspective. I prefer to either use a sort of selective omniscience, where I just show, well, in my novel, I mostly show Ingvar through the eyes of Aiden, who is the actual protagonist of the story. So Aiden never knows exactly what Ingvar thinks. It's Ingvar is a puzzle to him. He has to discover him, and the reader has to discover Ingvar along with him. So that's the challenge of it. It's a bit of a puzzle game for me to write those parts, but it's fun.
Hmm.
And uh, because I think, in general, that kind of omniscient narration is not really natural, right? In real life, we only know what we think. We don't know what everybody else thinks. So I like to let the reader do a bit of detective work, and figure out for themselves, what do they think that person is like. I mean, other people, yeah, the protagonist, you don't really know the people around him. And that's, well, it has its challenges, I have to say.
Hmm. What was the easiest thing about writing Lucky Wolf?
No, I always start with the dialogues, and the teasing between them, the way they say things with double meanings. Elf loves annoying Ingvar, but at the same time wants to catch his attention and to impress him, but he does it in a way that Ingvar finds him really annoying in the beginning. So I had a lot of fun writing those parts. I think that those are the first parts that I wrote from the actual story. When I started writing, I had the main idea. I had, of course, the characters in mind, and then I knew what would happen. I mean, where the story was going, what was going to happen in the end. But when I actually started writing, I began with those dialogues between them. It was the first things I imagined, the
Mm.
first scenes I imagined.
Yeah, those dialogues were really lively. I think they really helped the characters to come to life, and it was very easy to see how they differed, but at the same time, what drew them together.
Yeah, I'm glad I managed to convey that.
Hmm. I think a lot of the time it is easier to kind of start writing scenes as a series of dialogues because a lot of the time, like a lot of the descriptions are hard to do. Like you have it all in your head already, but sometimes it's just easier to make everything more simple by just making out the dialogues and then just jotting down a few notes for what the prose, like describing the scene, is going to be like, and then you start writing the other parts in.
Yeah, definitely. I greatly enjoy writing and reading dialogue. I think most people do. But I mean, at least I know a lot of writers who really enjoy that. I don't know how much readers enjoy reading dialogue, but I really do. So, yeah, those are indeed the easiest. Of
Hmm.
course, other difficult things to write are, well, apart from descriptions, which, yeah, well, apart from descriptions of gestures, uh, which are very important in a story, especially if you are doing um, selective omniscience perspective or the camera eye point of view where you don't explain the character's thoughts, so you just have to convey what they think through the gestures. So of course the unless we count the descriptions of gestures and of thoughts where you have to describe thoughts, I think other types of descriptions are pretty I mean, they don't come easy to me. uh, yeah, you said that it's sort of similar to you as well, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and well, action scenes are, I don't think they are very easy on anyone, the fighting scenes and all that, but they are fun eventually. But they also take a lot of planning and some research so that they feel natural to someone who has some I don't know, some real life experience in that kind of thing. I don't know, reenactment or something. I don't want those people to think, oh, that's so stupidly written. Nobody would ever do that. So of course we have to do some research in that respect as well.
That's true. Yeah, I think for action scenes, it's definitely difficult for me because I guess that's why I never really write any action scenes. It just all takes place inside the character's head. It's just easier for me.
Yeah, I don't really imagine how it would be like to write an entire novel based on action and fighting, where there's like a fight scene every 5 pages. I don't really imagine. I think that would be so difficult to write. I've actually made it a sort of a challenge to do something like that, with my Outlaws story. I want there to be more action in that story. Ironically, when I started, I won't be talking about that story much, but I just want to say this, that when I finished Lucky Wolf, I said, oh, the next story I'm going to make is going to be simple, just thought driven. I will not think about themes and symbolism and subtext, just people fighting, which of course that was a silly thought because I didn't end up doing that at all. Mostly because I didn't find it attractive enough to just write that kind of plot, and I didn't find it easy at all. I have no idea why I thought it would be easy. It's actually really difficult to write action scenes. So I say no. I'll just stick to what I know. So people walking around and thinking, and yes, they are fighting, and they're fighting in Lucky Wolf. They're fighting in many of my stories, but not as many fights as one may imagine or as I was planning initially.
Mm-hmm. How about Sons of Disobedience? I know you're still working on it, but like, are there going to be a lot of fight scenes in Sons of Disobedience, or is it around the same as Lucky Wolf?
Well, I think there have to be more fight scenes because the plot is, well, it's constructed around that conversion of Norway to Christianity, which the sagas, of course, describe as full of fighting and intrigue, and everybody was betraying everybody, and King Olaf Tryggvason, who is well, the king who makes it happen. Uh, uh, this is how he does it. So if I don't give a sense of that, it will not feel historical. But so yes, it will have more of that type of scenes because um, it's about a war. It's the conversion happened through a series of battles, so I have to go into that. But since it's a novel, I can have a lot of scenes that are not about fighting as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is what I'm trying to balance right now because my first draft of the novel, which is, well, has been finished for a while, but I'm not pleased with a lot of things. Is just has one fight in the end, and it has some minor fights along it, but not, I don't know, not significant, not interesting enough. So I want to change that balance. I want
Mm-hmm.
to change it a bit. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
So, do you have any advice in general for people who are writing historical fiction or thinking of writing historical fiction for the first time?
Uh, well, of course, it's important to do research, and it's important to know uh, the setting that you want to write about. And well, reading, I don't know, uh, papers from academic journals maybe sounds a bit, I don't know, boring, but uh, I think it's also important to do that. Of course, you can write, if you write again. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Viking Age, kind of medieval fiction, or Dark Ages in general. Of course, you can read saga literature, but that will not be enough because sagas are. They were designed as adventure stories, so they are far-fetched themselves. So maybe reading something that has also interpretation of actual historians, that will be a lot more helpful than doing that. So it's good to have the basics at least. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect because I was never into that kind of historical fiction that has entire pages saying at that time so and so was king and he had, I don't know how many sons, and at the time people were doing this and that. I was never fond of that. I always think those should be those kind of pieces of information have to be integrated naturally into the story. So don't make pages that sound like they come out of a history book,
Mm-hmm.
of a school textbook from history, because that will be boring to everyone. There's 19th century historical novels did that a lot, and I always skip those pages to my shame. So I was interested in history, but not the theory, of that as much. I wanted to see how it was applied, how they actually lived, what they were doing. Yeah, not really those textbook pages. So yeah, I I think that is one piece of advice. Don't make a lot of world building that is just that, pages of world building.
Hmm. I think that the
Just
same thing applies to fantasy as well. I think a lot of people, especially if they're just starting a new series or a movie, they don't necessarily want to be info dumped by lots of information, especially for fantasy as opposed to like historical, because fantasy is like a completely different world, right? So there's going to be even more information about how that world works, what kind of magic is there, and just the politics of that world. So like I think fantasy writers would also have to take heed and think about the balance of their work. They can't just dump so much information in front of the audience at the beginning. They have to kind of like gradually kind of build it up.
definitely, yes. This is what I was thinking as well. That fantasy has even more of that, more need of a world building, and at the same time, authors have to be more careful about that,
Hmm.
because yeah.
I think a lot of world building, like the authors should, definitely write a lot about it, but like not immediately put that in a chapter. Like maybe just put it aside and refer to it as you write chapters. For example, chapter 1, I'm going to mention this about the world, but I'm not going to mention too much of it. In chapter 8, for example, I'll build on that. So basically you have like, characters and world building in every chapter kind of balanced. Maybe like 30% world building, 70% characters in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's like 60% world building, 40% character. It can't just all be like, chapter 1, 2, 3, 100% world building. Chapter 2, 90% world building and 10% character. Like that wouldn't be a very good balance, I think, unless, that chapter was kind of like, kind of like Tolkien at the end of his books, he had a lot of stuff about the maps and like how the world worked. That would work. But like if it's an actual chapter where the plot's taking place, I think it might be a little bit more difficult to execute. But then again, I'm not an expert on fantasy writing, and I haven't really tried writing a fantasy story like that, so I can't really say. But I think from my experience dealing with historical fiction, it's just probably a better idea, especially for people starting out and who don't really have an expertise in it, to space things out.
Right, definitely, yes.
Hmm.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Now, I find fantasy fiction so challenging to
Hmm, it
write, so
is.
I would not even get into that. I mean, I know some people say that historical fiction requires so much work and so much research that I'm not being bothered by that. But I don't know, I see it quite the opposite. I think fantasy is more challenging to write.
Definitely, especially if you're trying to write a kind of fantasy that is, well balanced, like I said, and basically appeals to a wider range of people. Because yes, you can include a lot of information and like encyclopedic information in your work, but it's kind of hard to market it sometimes when it's so heavy. You know what I mean? I think it
Definitely, yes.
scares off a lot of potential readers. It could,
Right,
at
yeah.
least, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, when we talk about high fantasy, yeah, definitely.
Hmm. Well, thank you for joining us today. This was very enlightening. We've learned a lot about Lucky Wolf and all the thinking you've done into it. And we learned a lot about historical fiction as well. It was very enlightening. And, thank you for coming on again. And next week or the week afterwards, we can talk more about Lucky Wolf, Sons of Disobedience, or any other story that you'd like to discuss.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun, and I've enjoyed your video so far. So I'm really happy to be here and to be here again sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.